Hello everyone, Spirit of Thersites here. Today I'm going to take a look at the various candidates who have been put forward as potential 2024 Republican nominees. In the past I've looked at the dynamics of Democratic primaries, but now I will try my hand at looking at the Republican field. Of course, this is really far out from when the election will take place, and any number of major developments could occur which would dramatically shift the landscape and change the viability of any number of the people we see on the screen, or even introduce new people who are not currently in the running. The Republican Party is enduring something of a civil war right now, and it is unclear exactly where the future of the party lies. There is a very strong Trump faction, but the anti-Trump faction, which was suppressed for 4 years, has come out of the closet. In the case of Lindsey Graham, that metaphor actually makes a lot of sense. And now they are trying to reassert themselves. The exact amount of strength that each faction has at this point is unclear. The January 6th riot, however, very much did empower the old school Republicans, or I guess really the old Tea Party, versus the newer right-wing populist movement. Just some general notes that I have here before we get into each candidate. One thing that a lot of people who have done this same video concept don't seem to get, and to be fair, the people I've watched who have done this have all been hardcore Trump people, is that the Trump lane is not the only lane to the nomination. In 2012, Mitt Romney won using the moderate lane, which was the minority lane within the party, because the conservative lane was very congested. Everybody was trying to win by being the conservative in the race, and Romney ran more as a centrist, and he was able to accumulate about 40% or so, and the other side wasn't able to consolidate around a candidate in time to stop him. GOP primaries are winner-take-all, so it's not proportional the way that Democratic primaries are, so if you don't win the whole state, you don't get jack shit. So it's a different dynamic, and it is actually a pretty viable strategy to go with a strong minority position and try to ride that to victory. Also, I will be rating all of these figures based both on their potential to win the Republican nomination and to win a general election, and I will have to grade the general electability on a curve because Republicans are at a massive disadvantage when it comes to demographics and party registration. I have not looked at the new electoral map in detail. There have been some changes. It looks like those favor the Republicans a tiny bit because a lot of Republican states have gotten a little stronger, especially Florida. But in general, because a couple of the states have grown, Arizona and Georgia are becoming more blue over time, or at least winnable for Democrats. That is not great for Republicans. But in general, they've had this problem for a while. Since 1992, the Republicans have only won the popular vote in 2004. So anytime they win, they're looking for an electoral college win where they still lose the popular vote by 2 to 7 million. So election victories on technicalities without any kind of mandate. A lot will depend on how well Biden does. And we don't know who the Democratic nominee will be in 2024, although it seems very likely it will be Kamala Harris, unfortunately. Republicans can't really win for the reasons that I just outlined in brief, but Democrats can lose if they nominate the wrong person. And Kamala is someone who is very weak politically. Her instincts are poor, and she has a tendency to engage in cringe. So, not to mention she has no class consciousness, and that is not great for a Democrat, especially if you're trying to compete for lower-income voters who are increasingly going Republican in spite of the lack of any substantive help from that party. Another thing to keep in mind is that being far-right often does help in primaries, especially if you're far-right on social positions, but if you're too far-right on economics and on social issues, in a general election that makes you more or less unelectable, especially if the public perceives you that way. In 2016, when Trump won, he was perceived as a moderate by many voters. They saw him as one of the more moderate Republicans because of his stances on trade and his firm commitment to not cut entitlements. A lot of the other Republicans that we'll talk about are people who are on the record saying that we need to cut Medicare and Social Security, and those positions, if they were exposed in a general, would be toxic, and they would be put in the Mitt Romney boat. Also, hi to Mitt Romney. He's on this list as well. One thing that occurs to me is that Republicans who want to win absolutely have to have an economically populist message. So they have to talk about trade, they have to talk about inequality. Of course, being Republicans, they're not going to actually do anything about those issues, but they need to talk about them. And it also depends on an idiot corporate Democrat not responding to that and wanting to move away from class because it's too icky. So if the Democrats make the mistake of nominating Harris or Booker or one of their other favorites, then Republicans have an open flank to the left of the Democrats, the same thing that Trump did to Hillary. It could work again. Also, in terms of a prime age to be president, at this point the age range is extended some. I think that really a viable candidate is anybody between about the ages of 40 to 70. Even though you're eligible at 35, I don't think most people would be willing to entrust the entire nation to someone under 40 because they would be perceived as too young and inexperienced. If you're over 70, you're just old. And while old people have won in recent memory, I think that people are growing weary of being governed by a gerontocracy. Also, you want to have some change over time and some symbolic change, and one way to do that is to elect someone who will still be alive 10 years after they're elected president. So, those are my preliminary thoughts on this. And I will also, for any of you who tuned in at random and you're not familiar with my channel, I am an ardent leftist. I am not a Republican by any stretch of the imagination. If I were rating these people based on just how much I like them, I would just fill the F tier and the video would be over already. I would never vote for any of these people under any circumstances. I'd rather have my testicles removed by a cheese grater. Also, though, I adamantly hate the Democratic Party as well. They are far too corporatist, and most of my other videos on this channel at least are critical of them. For the most part, Republicans are just too easy as targets, so don't bother. But in this case, I figured, fuck it, why not? Just hit the 20,000 subscriber milestone on my other channel, wanted to have a little fun, but also do something I don't normally do. So let's go through all of these candidates and talk about how electable they are or are not. First up is Steve Bannon. And at this point, I'm already questioning the wisdom of whoever assembled this list. Steve Bannon is not a legitimate candidate for public office, much less the presidency. Now, Bannon is an intelligent guy, and he had some strategic sense. He helped set up what became right-wing populism, and he was an early supporter of Trump who helped put him on a path to win. He's also given some bad advice later on. But the main reason why Bannon is a non-starter is that he has ethical issues. The guy is basically guilty of money laundering, and even most Trump people admit that. He also has a far-right network of parties he's affiliated with from Europe. And right now, a lot of those parties are doing their utmost to curtail democracy, especially Viktor Orban in Hungary. And all of the negative things that they do in Europe will then be things that people can use to bash Steve Bannon. So Bannon is basically a non-starter for those reasons. He also just does not appear presidential. He has been accused on many, many occasions of being a white supremacist. And while it has been exaggerated the degree to which he is racist, there is plenty of evidence that he is in fact racist. It would be very hard to defend him on those grounds. I pity any fool who signs up for his campaign and tries that. Steve Bannon is an easy F, one of the weaker candidates on here. Even though, as I said, he is a man with some ability, but he's got a lot of baggage. And while I don't know if he drinks or not, he certainly just looks like an alcoholic. And that is not something that people want to vote for. Could just have allergies, who knows. Next up is Dan Bongino. He's a guy who is a radio host. He's associated with alternative tech. He has run for Congress 3 different times, lost each and every time. Former NYPD officer and also former Secret Service. He has been a hardcore Trump defender, and he is an ardent anti-masker. Now, a lot of the Trump people assume anyone who defends Agent Orange will automatically be a badass, but as I explained earlier, the problem with that is that a whole lot of people on this list are trying to compete for that lane. There's only so much space, and unfortunately for Dan Bongino, there's none for him. He just isn't accomplished enough. He just doesn't stand out in the field. He's an F. Also, not to mention that given his lack of credentials in a general election, he would get crushed. I didn't mention it with Bannon. Mostly it's the charisma issue for the primary. I think a lot of Republican voters would like Bannon, but they wouldn't really vote for him. And when it comes to a general election, you gotta be kidding. He would get fucking annihilated. So, those two are done. Next up is Candace Owens. She, in my opinion, is a little bit too young. Now, she would technically be 35 in 2024, which I think actually makes her slightly younger than AOC, who has been bandied about a little bit as a potential Democratic nominee for 2024. But as I explained earlier, I think that's a little too young. I don't think a lot of voters are willing to entrust the country to someone under 40. Could be wrong. I don't know. Candace Owens is obviously a young black woman. She made a name for herself starting in 2015 or 16, coming out as a black woman supporter of President Trump, then candidate Trump. And there really isn't much special about Candace Owens. She is relatively attractive and has a bit of charisma, but she really isn't very deep on the issues. She often gets exposed in interviews for not really having more than a superficial grasp of the issues, if that. A lot of times she doesn't do her homework before she does interviews. And really, I hate to say it, but she is limited to being just a conservative media token. A lot of people of color go on television and talk about being Republicans to try to represent their demographic within the party. And it's not because they are able representatives of that viewpoint. It's simply because the Republicans are looking for anyone from that demographic who's willing to toe the line. Candace Owens is that person. She's made a lot of money doing it, but she's not necessarily that great at it otherwise. In a general election, she would be laughed off the stage. There's no way that Democrats would be attached enough to identity politics to vote for her. And yes, I know Democrats are obsessed with identity politics right now, but what really drives them is the D after a person's name. That's what puts the halo on their head. Just like with Republicans, the thing that makes them loyal to a nominee is that R in parentheses after their name. There's very little else. And you might think right now the party is owned by Trump, but I guarantee you as soon as there's a new nominee, all of a sudden the party will forget all about him and all the loyalists will have the yard signs out and talk about how they were always in favor of whatever it is that new guy is in favor of. So Candace Owens, for that reason, is an F, although I do think that she's probably more able to make an impact than either Bannon or Bongino. I could see her surging temporarily, just like in the 2012 primary when Bachmann temporarily surged to the top, and then, what's-his-face, Herman Cain, the 999 guy, with 65 lawsuits for sexual harassment, temporarily took first place. Yeah, 2012 was wild. If you want to learn more about the dynamics of the Republican Party, look back at 2012. You can learn so much. Next up is Charlie Baker. He is the current governor of Massachusetts, and he is basically a moderate Republican. The Trump people despise this man. They think of him as a rhino. They put him in the F tier. They say he's useless. I think that they're underestimating him a little bit. Now, Charlie Baker, it's true, is kind of a throwback to the pre-Trump era. If anything, he's basically a Bush Republican. He is, in their mind, socially liberal. If you look at his views, I do not consider him to be socially liberal. I see him as more socially moderate. If you're trying to get elected in Massachusetts, or at this point in the country as a whole, the social conservative positions are cancerous, and they will fuck you in the ass. So he's actually being pretty smart with that. You can get away with being pro-life, but when it comes to being anti-gay and some of that other stuff, it just doesn't fly anymore, and it is no longer within the Overton window. There's just not a lot of support for that outside of the Republican primary field. That being said, his more moderate views socially would hurt him in the primary and make it very hard for him to be the guy to fill that anti-Trump lane. He also has some other things going against him. He's a former healthcare CEO. So he is the kind of guy in a general election, if he was to make it to the nomination, he is an obvious toady of the insurance industry at a time when more and more Americans, including a lot of Republicans, are in favor of Medicare for all or some other single-payer system. So that would be a huge millstone around his neck. Also, while he has won in Massachusetts, his first victory was over Martha Coakley. who is possibly one of the absolute weakest candidates alive and kicking in America today. In 2010, she lost the Senate race. No, this was not 2010. It was a special election after Ted Kennedy died. So it was 2009. She lost to fucking, what's his name? That guy, Scott Brown in Massachusetts, who did the truck thing. So she got beaten by him because she was walking around Massachusetts saying, "I'm a Yankees fan." For those of you who don't know, there's a huge rivalry between Boston and New York in sports. That was incredibly dumb. So they put her up again for whatever reason to run for governor. I have no idea why. Whoever voted for her in the primary must have been high on something. I don't know. Massachusetts voters really are of the opinion that they're smart because of how many universities are in Boston. But a lot of times they do make some pretty awful decisions when it comes to candidates. Anyway, Martha Coakley got her ass kicked by this guy. I barely count that as a victory, even though it is a deep blue state. I mean, Martha Coakley is inept on another level. She's next level stupid when it comes to politics. Yeah, he's a relatively popular governor from what I can tell. Very fiscally conservative, though. Republicans who say that he's a rhino apparently have not looked into his record much. Either that or they're massively overweighting social issues, which again, are at this point, social conservatism is completely inactionable just because of the popularity of it being nothing. Baker, I could actually see him potentially doing okay-ish in a general election. He'd have to balance the ticket with a conservative, but I could maybe see it. I mean, again, any Republican's a long shot right now, unless Biden really fucks up with the recovery. But I'll go with a D. The problem here is that I don't see how he wins the primary unless he's more charismatic than I realize, which I don't think he is. But he is rather weak. And again, I'm grading on a curve, so normally I'd probably give him an E for electability based on his actual odds in a general. But the Republicans you have to be generous to in this situation because things don't look too good on the national scene in a general election cycle. Next up is Condoleezza Rice, a veteran of the Bush administration. And for those of you who are new, I have a deep-seated hatred for the Bush administration, and I consider him the second worst president in American history behind only James Buchanan, who was responsible for allowing the American Civil War to break out. And Condoleezza Rice is one of the enablers. She will be 69 or 70 at the time of the election. I only wish she were older, so that would make her less viable. She is basically a neocon. That's really what she's known for, is being extremely hawkish on foreign policy. However, among the neocons, she's known as being one of the more intellectual ones. She's very well-spoken. She's respected by leaders around the world. She's well-read. She's a professor. So she's someone who has a lot of intellectual firepower. Unfortunately, her views are detrimental to the interest of America. She's mainly seen as a centrist, although her views are actually very conservative. And it's amazing how little you have to be liberal on to be considered a centrist or a rhino within the Republican Party. People talk about the left having purity tests, but it pales compared to what they have on the right. She's a centrist because she's pro-choice. And also she thinks the civil rights movement in the 60s was cool because, you know, it helped her and all the people she knows and grew up with. So I guess she's basically a liberal, according to a lot of Republicans. Okay. She also did take part in the Ban Bossy campaign in 2014, where a lot of women got together and said that bossy is a negative stereotype about women. And so there are probably other Republicans who would see that as being SJW-esque. That being said, I don't know exactly what the temper of the Republican electorate will be going into the actual 2024 race. If it is what it is now and people are still obsessing over Trump, then should be fucked. If, however, Republicans have realized that they are playing at a disadvantage, then someone like Rice might seem a little more appealing, and the fact that she is a little bit more centrist at least would also be more appealing. I could actually see her doing better than I'd like to imagine in a general, just because she is someone who comes across as an adult in the room, even though her ideas are terrible. In a primary, it's a little bit harder of a sell, but balancing those two things out, I think she's about a C. I don't think she is as impossible as a lot of people think. And again, I say this with regret because I do not want any throwbacks to the Bush years. Those years were dark and just abysmal in general. Next up is Dan Crenshaw. He is most famous for that horrible ad he ran in the last election cycle where he was putting together a team of Texans to run and take the House. And he showed some lack of political ability by inadvertently burying everyone who was not a veteran. So at first it starts out as a lame-ass action movie where he parachutes down and he meets an F-22 pilot and some helicopter pilot. And they're talking about how badass they are and how cool, and then they're strutting around. Then they go and meet some lame-ass business people who are also running for office. The problem with this, of course, is that you can't go from we're a bunch of badasses and veterans who do cool shit to now let's go find some dorks working in office to fill out our team because we can't find enough cool people, so we're going to have to find some cannon fodder. It buries those people. They can't really compete with what the other people started out with. So this is just basic politics 101. And if you want to learn more about how not to bury people, watch Jim Cornette's podcast. He can explain this in pro wrestling terms. Surprisingly, a lot of the Trump people actually see Dan Crenshaw as a traitor who sold them out because he basically said the insurrection was wrong. Shocking view, huh? Anyway, Crenshaw, I think, actually could be appealing in a general. And I say that unfortunately. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's very conservative. He wants to repeal the ACA. He has done quite a bit of stuff. He was in favor of all of the dipshit lawsuits after the election where Trump was pretending that he didn't lose. He also was in favor of letting Medicare negotiate drug prices, but then backed off of that in 2019 or so, silently. There's also a perception among Republicans that he sold out. I think that that's pretty much accurate in terms of him siding more with the establishment as he saw the Trump ship slowly sinking. That being said, Crenshaw has kind of a Chris Pratt thing going on. And of course, Chris Pratt is very popular. Crenshaw also has a certain amount of charm when he's not cringing it up with those lame action videos. He's actually really good in one-on-one interviews. Not quite as good as someone like, say, Andrew Yang, but surprisingly close. You know, he can come across as very personable. And I think he might be able to parlay that into campaigning. I've never seen him on the trail, so I don't really know. The problem would be the primary, but I think he could be the kind of guy who actually does fill that lane. And he's on the younger side of what I'd consider to be the political prime. But I think he's within that group, that age group that I identify as the most viable in the context of we just had two very old presidents in a row. He would be in his early 40s. I think anybody from 40 to 55 has a little bit of an edge. I'm actually going to go with a B for Dan Crenshaw. I can't go higher because his positions don't really make him stand out at all. He has no real signature issue, and the only thing he's got going for him really is that he is a decorated veteran, and he's got some youth and charm, but that might be enough. He's also not a complete toady to Trump, so that one lane I was talking about that will be less crowded could fall to someone like him. Might have a bit of charisma, not entirely sure. I'm not super familiar with his work. Next up is Dan Patrick. He is someone who is not very interesting. He's mostly a guy who focuses on saying things on Twitter to piss off the left. So I guess if the number one issue in 2024 is owning the libs, then maybe he'll be pretty good. I don't know. He's not all that well known, which could be a good thing. So for instance, he does not have Bannon's reputation as being a white supremacist. It's always a plus. And he also said that Trump was lying, but then defended Hawley and Cruz from attacks. That's politically savvy in terms of keeping the Republicans happy, because a lot of them disapprove of what happened on January 6th, but at the same time, talking to Republican voters, I mean, at the same time, they don't want to see their boys go down for inciting a riot. I can't really give him a very accurate rating just because of how little I've been able to find about him. I'm going to put him in D for now. That's the one I feel the least confident in out of this entire list, by the way. Next up is Eric Trump. Eric Trump is the Trump son who gets the most shit from SNL. I think that negative portrayal could hurt him the way that SNL's portrayal of Gerald Ford hurt him. That being said, I don't think it's entirely fair. Eric is not nearly as bumbling as he's made out to be on SNL, and if anything, he's quite a bit smarter than his brother Don Jr. He is a better speaker, and he comes across with less obnoxious swagger. He's still got a little bit of it. I mean, the guy grew up rich. All rich kids who now run a business that they didn't earn are going to have some swagger and feel entitled, but he's less terrible about that when compared to his brother. He was an okay speaker at the Republican convention. I actually thought he did fairly well. I was pretty surprised. That being said, also comes across a little more stable than his brother in a lot of ways. He is on the younger side, though. I think he'll be a little over 40. The main problem for Eric is I don't think he's a very assertive guy, and I don't think he will seek this out until A, his father's dead, and B, Don Jr. and Ivanka have passed up on the opportunity to run. I think that he sees it as their right to run first. He seems a little submissive in that regard, so I can't imagine him seeking it. And I don't really know what he'd be like as a candidate. But because I don't think that he will run, just because he'll be deferential to his other family members, I'm going to put him in the E category. If his father decides not to run, and then his brother and sister decide not to run, then, we can revisit that. He might actually have the best chance of the three kids of getting somewhere, although I don't think that he would get very far. A lot of times, voters do not reward the children of politicians just because they have that name, at least not nationally. When it comes to more local races, when someone has that name recognition in a district, a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention, and all they see is the last name on the ballot, and they forget that it's someone new. So that's kind of how that works. But in general, people do not enjoy sending the children of politicians to take their parents' place. That's something that is not as popular as commonly thought. After Eric Trump, we have Matt Gaetz, who is another youngish Trump-supporting congressman. There are some people who consider him to be somewhat liberal on social issues, and again, it is because he's liberal on a single issue, which I always find that weird with the Trump people. You find one issue that someone is not in lockstep with Trump on, and they're like, oh no, he's a little liberal. Anyway, the one issue he's liberal on is he is okay with legalizing marijuana. He's not an outright proponent of it, but at the same time, he's indicated that he would vote for it, probably. And I think that's actually an asset, especially outside of the primary. A lot of people are realizing that the prohibition against marijuana is idiotic. Joe Biden could have won a lot more votes if he had give up on his 1950s fear of the reefer. Biden actually said the science isn't in. It's been in for fucking decades. I don't know why people are dragging their heels on weed. It's stupid. Move on. It's 2021. We know. So anyway, Matt Gaetz, he's basically a Trump guy, and like a whole lot of people on this list, he wants to abolish the EPA, and even though he does say climate change is real, but he just doesn't want to do anything about it. So in the Republican primary, that's a fairly moderate or mainstream stance. Not enough to endear him with that wing that's anti-Trump, but not hard enough to endear him with a lot of the Trump loyalists who see him as kind of a second stringer, a good guy, a good young rising guy, but not really someone who's ready. He can't really rally the other part of the party unless he does something else. His pro-weed stance would be useful in his youth, would be useful in a general, but overall I see him as rather weak, and he is an E. He just doesn't stand out enough. Next up is Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas. He is famous as being one of the few disabled public officials right now, at least prominent public officials, aside from Senator Tammy Duckworth. He is in a wheelchair. Basically, he is more or less the evil twin of FDR. He's just a business and oil stooge. And by evil twin, I mean an inverse. He's just a stooge for big oil and business, just like every Republican Texas governor ever. George W. Bush, Rick Perry, you name them. They're just there to suck the cock of ExxonMobil and to do nothing else. He is anti-gay in 2021. way to go. That's a position which will really carry outside of Texas. So many people are looking for that. He's anti-abortion, of course, because that's what Republicans do. And he's also one of those people who's really into culture war bullshit, especially the old school Fox News pro-Christmas stuff. He got involved in some lawsuit over a secular nativity scene, so excellent use of taxpayer money. That's one of those things that might play okay in the Republican primary, but ultimately, even most Republican voters in the primary won't be opposed to it, but at the same time, they're not going to be like, oh wow, he's our savior. He'll save us from nativity scenes that aren't perfect. That's the main problem. He had a very poor response to COVID. Now, of course, he could sell that in the Republican primary. We're talking about how he's concerned about freedom and all that. But in the general, people will remember COVID responses, and all the governors will be held accountable for their COVID responses, I guarantee you. Unless it's Cuomo, because apparently the perception is Cuomo did well, even though he did really badly. But won't get into that now because Cuomo's a Democrat. Anyway, Greg Abbott, in my opinion, is an E. The only reason he's as high as he is because as a governor, he has a certain amount of respectability that the people in the F tier do not have. Republicans tend to prefer governors when they're making their nominating choices, so that does help him significantly. Next up is Nikki Haley. So Nikki Haley actually is one of those people who is kind of a resume patter. She spends a few years in a position, so now technically she has experience across a broad swath of government. I forget what she did before being South Carolina governor, but I believe she was an attorney, because fucking all of them are attorneys. She was the governor of South Carolina, known for a bit of cringe. She made people pick up the phone in South Carolina offices and say, "Isn't it a great day to be in South Carolina?" or something like that. She was middling popular as the governor. South Carolina governors are pretty hands-off. The state government's pretty minimal, so there's not really much opportunity to do anything. She then became UN ambassador, and she had an interesting career. As governor, to backtrack, she tried to tie teacher salaries to performance. That's something Republican voters are all about, so that would play well in a primary, maybe not so well in a general, although it would not hurt her. It just wouldn't help her either, necessarily. She backed Rubio at first in 2016. When Rubio dropped out, she backed Cruz, and then she reluctantly backed Trump at the end. So she was kind of a never-Trumper. But then she eventually joined the Trump administration as his UN ambassador, and for the next 2 years she carried water for Trump. A lot of Trump people see her as an outright neocon because of things that she said, without realizing that everything she said was at the behest of Donald Trump. Yeah, that's how it works when you're the UN ambassador. Now she has a PAC or some sort of organization, I don't know exactly, called Stand for America. And, yeah, it's just basically one of these other groups talking about how America needs to be tough on Iran. So basically she's just an establishment foreign policy person who is now an expert because she spent 2 years as UN ambassador reading talking points, because that's how that works. And also she has a bunch of ties to Boeing. I believe she's on their board now, making bank. So she is corrupt and establishment. But most of these guys are, even the ones who are Trump friends. So there you go. Nikki Haley is not great in many ways. But she does have enough credibility with the anti-Trump wing that I could see her being the person that they go for if none of the other candidates who are a little more credible in that step in. She's relatively young. I think she'll be in her early 50s when 2024 takes place. By political standards, she's fairly attractive. She's a woman of color. So she could have a kind of representational edge. Republicans like to put up candidates who are non-white to say, see, we're not racist. So because of those things, I could see her going a decent distance in the primary. She also is very positive and optimistic. That's kind of her personality. She's more bubbly than a lot of these people. And a lot of people in both primaries and generals respond well to that. So that's something that could help her. That being said, because of how superficial her resume is in many ways, I can't put her above a C. but she's one of those people who isn't horrible. I mean, as a potential nominee, as someone who might do something. Alright, next up is another governor from Maryland, Larry Hogan. If only it were Hulk Hogan, but it's not. Anyway, Larry Hogan is actually the second most popular governor in America, which is shocking, actually, because Maryland's a deep blue state. He's a Republican governor. I think this is his second term, so they haven't gotten sick of him yet. Kind of impressive, especially when you consider that the state legislature has overridden his veto at least twice, and also he tries to do a Nixonian kind of weasel move to undercut liberal legislation, and it's failed a couple times. So, for instance, at one point, Maryland was doing paid family leave, or was sick leave, I don't know exactly, and the Democrats in the state house were putting together a bill, so Hogan's solution was to put together his own version that was massively watered down. And the Democrats, rather than meeting him halfway, they said, no, your bill sucks, passed their bill, overrode his veto, and it's now the law. And that's happened to him on another issue, too. I can't remember which one. Yeah. Anyway, so he's basically a guy who's ineffective and weak, but for some reason very popular. He's another one of those guys who is very fiscally conservative, or at least fiscally moderate. I mean, if you're in a deep blue state, there's only so far right you can go without getting booted. And as I said, he did get reelected, and he's maintained his popularity somehow, without actually being that successful, which is weird. I mean, the guy hasn't really accomplished all that much, but yet people like him. He has shown, however, that Republicans can win in blue states if they stick with fiscal conservatism, but leave social issues aside. Social issues are where Republicans really fuck themselves. The country is no longer with them. And the sooner they realize that, the more dangerous they will be. But it doesn't look like they're anywhere near realizing that, so okay. He vetoed a clean energy bill. That got overridden. That was the other one. And he also was opposed to Trump's family separation policy. This is clearly a guy who will not do well with the Trump crowd. So he's got no chance of winning them. And in fact, all the Trump people I've seen hate this guy. They just saw that he's not with Trump, so he sucks. The end. I don't think he's necessarily the worst person on this list, but the combination of being kind of weak and not really having the bona fides to clear the primary makes me think that he couldn't get out of the primary in the first place. If he did get out of the primary, he would be marginally electable, but he's not really someone who I see as being a presidential timber. I'm going to go with an, I don't know, E or F. I'm not sure. I'm going to go with an E. Pretty weak, but I don't think he's as shit as, say, Steve Bannon or Candace Owens. Next up is Ivanka Trump, daughter of the president, and either his oldest or second oldest child. I can never remember if she or Don Jr. is the oldest, and I frankly don't care. She has a reputation as being a social liberal among Republicans, and a lot of them distrust her for that reason. How socially liberal she actually is, I cannot say. I do know that she was registered as a Democrat until 2018. However, that did not prevent her from campaigning for her father from 2015 forward, even though he was running on some very right-wing stuff. So if she was a Democrat, it was probably just because she was in New York, was not very politically active, and maybe it had a streak of liberal activism for 10 seconds when she was in college or something. But I don't think there's any real evidence that she was ever liberal. At least I don't see it. The question I have is she interested? She does seem to be a little bit interested, maybe down the line. Right now, she's still interested in clothing and doing her clothing line and all that stuff, making her own business. She's been the most successful in business out of the Trump kids. Probably the most competent. I mean, who knows what Barron will turn out to be, but I think it's safe to say Ivanka's probably got some IQ points on Don Jr., Eric, and Tiffany. Pretty good speaker. She is good at sounding populist notes, even though it's ridiculous because she grew up as a billionaire. But she is pretty good at doing that. Not great, But one thing that she does have over her father is that her vocabulary and diction and delivery are all great. She's a skilled public speaker. So she's got that going for her. She does come across as a bit fake because she's very blonde and a little bit plasticky. But of course, Republicans are really into blondes. She's an attractive woman. She's got the Fox News host look. People like that, at least people on the right. In a general election right now, I think that the name Trump would be a hard hill to climb. And the fact that she was with her father throughout all of his tenure in the White House, she did not have the separation that her brothers had. So she was there when he was making bad decisions, when he was egging on the riot on January 6th. Now, she was on the record trying to oppose it, but clearly she failed, so she was not a very good handler. So for that reason, in a general, I see her as not very viable. In a primary, she could be a player, but I don't think she'd go much beyond that, and I also don't know if the Trump supporters would see her as the natural heir just because she's his biological heir. I'll give her a D. She's someone who could win that Trump lane, but I don't really know for sure. And I think that she's a little too deep in with the Trump crowd to have any chance at the Never Trump wing of the party. Now, of course, they would probably come around if she was nominated, but it would be a hard fight and an uphill one. Next up is Missouri Senator Josh Hawley. For some reason, I always think that he's from Arkansas. I get him confused with Tom Cotton. Whatever, it doesn't matter. They're the same in my mind. Anyway, Josh Hawley is someone who has had a couple of genuine populist moments. And for a minute, I actually thought that he was a lot more moderate than he actually was. His two moments recently, one is during the $2,000 stimulus checks. He was on Bernie Sanders' side. That eventually got cut down to $600. He was one of the more outspoken voices in that debate. Pretty much the only Republican calling for it. So he stood out in that regard. And the other thing that he did when he was Attorney General in Missouri that could be used to his credit, especially in a general, but also even in a Republican primary, where there are people who like populist action, is that he used antitrust laws, or at least tried to use antitrust laws on Google, and he also went after some opioid manufacturers. Now, Josh Hawley is a fairly shameless political climber. When he was running for Attorney General, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, something like that, he decried people who were just there to get a line item on their resume and then move on to better things. And he said, I'm not one of those guys. I'll be here to fight for the great state of Missouri. And while he was active during his year or two in office, he immediately sought a Senate seat in 2018. When people asked him about his hypocrisy, he basically said, whatever, I didn't know the Senate seat would be available. So he basically said, I didn't know it was going to be a great opportunity. Fuck you. So the guy is a pretty shameless opportunist, which in a weird way I kind of respect. On everything else, he's very, very conservative. Right-wing to the hilt. Let's see, is there anything else about him that's interesting? He did very much push the election lie, so that will help him with the Trump crowd. I think that he is one of their favorites. And he, along with Cruz, has been trying to deny that Trump is in any way culpable for the riot. Also, they're still pushing the lie even after the riot. He is in hot water with a lot of his colleagues. Nothing will come of it, of course, because it never does. But Josh Hawley could be a real player. Personally, I think the guy is a snake, but he has shown some political instincts. Pushing for the $2,000 check was smart, not only because that was Trump's position, he came pretty late to it, but it was his position, and Hawley made sure he got his name out there as someone who cared about common people. And then he was a diehard loyalist to Trump, so he was doing what Chris Christie did back in 2016, going down with the ship. We'll talk more about that when we get to Mike Pence in a minute. So actually, I think Josh Hawley's an A. He's someone who very well could consolidate that Trump wing, especially if some of the other stronger contenders don't run. And I think that even though he did some damage with the non-Trumpers by pulling the bullshit that he pulled about election fraud, he could still win them over. They're not really that mad about it. They don't really care that much about the sanctity of elections, so whatever. Next up is Mike Pence, the former vice president. What's strange about Mike Pence is that a lot of the Trump people see him as a traitor because he did not overturn the election results on January 6th. Spoiler alert, he couldn't do it anyway. It wasn't possible. But anyway, they still wanted to hold him accountable for that, and there were people who were furious with him. They saw him as a traitor. Absolutely absurd. If I had been Mike Pence after carrying water for some president for 4 years who I didn't personally like, and then that person literally sicked a mob on me while I was trying to do my goddamn job, I would have pulled the 25th on that motherfucker so fast, his head would have spun. Mike Pence, and as this is not a good thing in this context, Mike Pence is the most loyal vice president to ever live. This man is more loyal than a dog. The fact that he didn't retaliate against Trump is just weak. I mean, it's pathetic. I never really have had much respect for Mike Pence because he's a religious nut job, and one of my positions is that we need to keep religious nut jobs as far away from power as humanly possible. So when people were talking about removing Trump, I was always thinking, I don't know. Mike Pence would probably be worse. Maybe we shouldn't, unless Pence goes with him. As governor, he was very much free trade, so the alliance between him and Trump was very much one of convenience. It united the two factions on trade, and then Pence brought in the evangelicals, or helped to bring them over. A lot of them think, for whatever reason, that he's sent by God. We'll come to someone who said that on many, many occasions in a little while. Pence doesn't have a lot of charisma, kind of boring, and although I am very secular, and sometimes I may overestimate how secular other people are, I do feel fairly safe in saying that most people are uncomfortable with how religious Mike Pence is, and how he calls his wife mother, and some of this other weird shit. So, because he is too stained by the Trump, by his association with Trump to win that Never Trump wing, and because he wasn't loyal, supposedly, on January 6th, he has no path. And in the general election, the dude's bland. He comes across as vaguely leader-like, but he seems more like someone doing a generic imitation of a president in a B movie rather than like a real president. So I have to put him in the E tier. Oh, the thing I was going to say about 2016 and Chris Christie, all the Republicans in 2016 assumed that Trump was dead in the water. And that's why Trump had so much trouble finding a running mate. His choice was John Kasich. And generally, if you think you're going to have the opportunity to be a VP, you take it. Especially if you're out of office already, as John Kasich was. Because when you're one heartbeat away from the president, and the president is 70 and obese, hey, it's a chance to be president. And it's not like a lot of these guys who are VP material are presidential, or could get elected on their own, otherwise they would. Kasich said no. And eventually, the most senior person who was not named Chris Christie, who was willing to do it, was Mike Pence. He had governmental experience as a governor. He was an actual Christian, unlike Trump, who just goes through the motions. So there you go. That's why he's on the ticket. And then Pence committed hard. He really gave Trump his all. I actually feel bad for Mike Pence, even though I hate him, which is a weird position to be in. Next up is the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem. Let's see, what can we say about Kristi? She spells her name with a K, by the way, Kristi, which is, I guess, a sort of new school spelling rather than an old school spelling. But it doesn't mean she's not conservative. How cool is that? Anyway, she has done no lockdowns in South Dakota. That will not play well in a general election. Most people are in favor of taking some precautions for COVID. A lot of people aren't into the full lockdowns because it hurts economically, especially when the government's not sending out checks or taking measures like other countries are taking. And we don't have an actual goddamn healthcare system. That doesn't help either. So that would be a liability in a general. In a primary, it'll be a purity contest, so she'll be able to do fine there. As a South Dakota governor, she has the positive sheen of being a governor. As I said, Republicans favor governors over congresspeople. And also, as a South Dakota governor, she's someone who can bemoan the downfall of the XL pipeline and also just benefit from her obscurity because she has the dignity of the office without much exposure, so that's maybe a good thing. I think that she also is someone who seems to have enough sense to not get on Twitter and run her mouth for 20 hours a day. She was aligned with Trump fairly early on, and she's been loyal. They've done press conferences together when he's visited or whatever. So she has that going for her without being too closely wedded to Trump. And the reason why she's not closer wedded is, again, South Dakota doesn't matter. It's very remote. It's out there. No one goes there if they can avoid it. Another thing she has going for her as an asset is that she's politician hot, for lack of a better term. I don't think that she's necessarily hot in the normal sense, but remember, politicians work on a different standard, and you're a young politician if you're under 60, and you're hot if you're not ugly. So, there you go. She's politician hot. She's a deficit hawk. That's something that is not popular right now, even among a lot of Republicans, especially when it comes to spending for COVID. All the people who are being deficit hawks are getting owned. I mean, fucking Joe Manchin, a Democratic senator out of West Virginia, just got destroyed by his own Republican governor, Jim Justice, for being a tightwad on COVID relief. So, this has not been a favorable environment for fiscal conservatives. I think a lot of people are starting to move on to modern monetary policy, and that will continue to be the case going forward. So, Dick Cheney actually, in many ways, is the forebearer of all that. Although, in his case, he's like, fuck it, I don't care about deficits, let's build some tanks. Let's see, what else about Noam? Oh yeah, she wants to balance the budget. Get this shit. Here's where the bad part comes in terms of electability. So she wants to slash the EPA. Alright, fairly standard Republican bullshit. She wants to slash Medicaid that goes to poor people. Increasingly, the Republicans are reliant upon poorer voters who are going more and more in their direction over time. So that's probably not very smart, but it's pretty typical Republican bullshit to try to fuck over the poor. And last but not least, she wants to slash the Veterans Administration. Now that is political cancer in a Republican primary or in a general. That is unacceptable. I'm surprised she's that incompetent. If it hadn't been for that one thing, I would probably say that she's about a B. But because of that Veterans Administration thing, that really makes me question her political skills. And I have to put her down to a C. That one thing alone might be enough to sink her chances. And because she isn't super tightly associated with either wing, I could see her trying to play the middle a bit. If she's trying to play strictly in the Trump lane, she's not going to do it because she's just not well enough known. If she tries to play the dark horse and tries to brand herself as someone who is new and has a slightly different outlook, basically a more successful version of Steve Bullock from this last election cycle among the Democrats, then maybe. But as things stand right now, path isn't clear, but there is potential. And she better hope that people don't read about her VA stance, because that would fuck her. Next up is Lindsey Graham. In the past, I've said that Lindsey Graham is the purest version of a warhawk possible. I stand by that comment now. If you want an example of someone whose primary purpose in the Senate is to advocate for an aggressive foreign policy, this is your guy. That's about all he does. Lindsey Graham is someone who has a very odd relationship with the truth. He poses as a heterosexual, but everyone knows that the guy is in the closet. It is not a secret. It's been rumored for years. We all know it. In terms of his age, he will be 69, so he will be sort of at the tail end of the age of viability. That being said, he has already proven himself to be a very poor candidate. In 2016, he ran, and his campaign never got the 1% so far as I'm aware. I did meet one person who, by the way, turned out to be one of the biggest douchebags I've ever encountered, someone who's an unironic fan of Creed and Nickelback, who had a Lindsey Graham sticker on his laptop because he's one of those guys who was a hardcore fan of Israel and foreign aggression. And he thought Lindsey Graham was the shit. I've never met anyone else who thinks that Lindsey Graham is cool, and for the most part, I don't know that many other people, even political junkies, know who the fuck Lindsey Graham is, unless they name him as McCain's boyfriend, which is basically what he was. When it comes to Lindsey Graham, he's got a lot of weaknesses, aside from being a war hawk and a neocon, which would make him good at raising money and nothing else. One major problem with being associated almost solely with foreign policy is that while foreign policy is very important, voters do not care. Now, I say they don't care, that's probably an overstatement. They don't care enough to vote based on foreign policy. Unless all other things are equal, they will vote for either economic or social issues. That's what gets votes. Foreign policy, the only thing that can fuck you on foreign policy is the perception of inexperience or of being excessively hawkish right now. And right now, Lindsey Graham is seen as being excessively hawkish. So he has no way to build a domestic base because he really doesn't have much of a domestic policy. One thing he does have going in his favor is that his voting record, as the Cato Institute bemoaned, is actually protectionist for the most part. So although a lot of people see him rightly as someone who opposed Trump and then kissed his ass when it became clear that Trump was the god of the Republican Party, the fact is that Lindsey Graham actually does agree with Trump genuinely on one issue. So they actually were not completely incompatible at first. He's also in favor of subsidies for business because the guy's a neocon, he loves corporate subsidies, and the defense contractors are some of the biggest corporations around. It makes sense. Lindsey Graham is an F. Also in a general election, his same problems would haunt him. I think he'd do better in a general than in a primary. But that being said, I don't think he would have a lot of success. He would just seem like George Bush 2.0. His foreign policy is deeply unpopular among the population. And he doesn't really have... Well, actually, now that I think about this, he's an E. Sorry. He can't win a primary, but if he somehow won by lightning striking and killing all the other candidates or whatever, then in that case, because he doesn't have much of a domestic policy, he could play the moderate. And he has the option to try to trick moderate Democrats into voting for him, and this would especially work if the Democrats nominated someone who was unpopular, by come out of the closet at that point. Because again, Democrats are really gullible when it comes to labeling Republicans as moderates. All they have to do is be moderate on one issue, or agree with them on one minor thing, and then they're one of the good ones. So all he's got to do is appeal to Democrats, but come out of the closet, and then all of a sudden, he's in contention. So, yeah. And lest you think I'm saying Democratic voters are dumb and Republican voters are smarter, no, Republican voters are also incredibly fucking stupid. There aren't very many educated voters in America, if we're being honest. Okay, next up is Marco Rubio. This is a guy who is not very popular within the Republican Party, at least among voters. And the reasons for that are that he is somewhat moderate on immigration. They say he's liberal, he's really more moderate. Because again, if you think about how conservative politicians operate, they'll be hardcore conservatives on every issue that doesn't affect them. When you get to an issue that touches them personally because of their identity or their experience, they'll be liberal or liberal-ish on that one thing. And then the base will look at them and say, hey, that guy's a liberal. But they're not. Otherwise, Rubio is pretty damn staunchly conservative. The problem is that the man has the charisma of cardboard. Actually, if anything, a cardboard cutout of Rubio where he's got a nice smile and where the lighting is good would be more charismatic than the real thing. He's a terrible speaker. Abysmal, actually. In the debates in 2016, he was pathetic. And Chris Christie played bully ball and beat him up over being repetitive. And rather than having the quickness on his feet and the mental legerity to change up his game as he's being called out for being repetitive and robotic, he then kept repeating the same fucking talking points. They just got called out for repeating too much. Not good on his feet, terrible in that regard. One thing he does have going for him is that he did denounce the Capitol riot very early on, and he has been seen as someone who is not really a Trump loyalist. While he did carry water for a while, he is not nearly as sycophantic as many, and he is a neocon, meaning that he could get a lot of establishment support. As a guy from Florida, you would think that he'd have some support from Florida. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that people's home states and the value of those home states in recent years has become very much overrated just because of national media and the internet. So a lot of people are aware of people outside of their own states. They don't necessarily vote for the person from their homeland. Kamala Harris had the California primary moved up to try to boost her. That clearly did her absolutely no good, because Californians realize that outside of their state there might be better people who more represent their values than Kamala Harris. Same thing here with Rubio. I think most Floridians realize that there are humans in the world who actually talk like people who mean things and have emotions and a personality. Rubio's an E. Next up is Mike Lindell, who is currently rather popular with the Republicans, although I suspect that this is a fairly condescending form of popularity. Lindell is famous as the founder of MyPillow, which is something that you buy from infomercials. It has been fairly successful. He's made a lot of money, and he has an interesting story. He was addicted to, at any given time between 1980-something and 2009, he was an alcoholic, a cokehead, and the thing that really people will focus on, a crackhead. Now, a lot of these guys on the screen here are cokeheads. Let's keep it real. Most of them use coke, or have used coke, in their younger years. Same thing for most of the Democrats and most business people. If you look at any given office building, after hours, most of those dudes are snorting lines. That's just a thing that wealthy people do. Not a big deal, I guess, because everybody does it. Crack, however, is extremely addictive and will really fuck you up. And as proof of that, look no further than Mr. Lindell. He's only 59, but if you look at a close-up of him, he looks like a guy who's about 75 who dyes his hair dark. He looks like absolute shit for his age. The only reason you can tell that he might be younger than 75 is because he doesn't walk like an old man. Maybe it's just that MyPillow helping align his spine. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, former crackhead and now a big Trump supporter. He has been a huge Trump fan ever since the very beginning, so of course Trump is a big fan of him because he's never betrayed him. Lindell was carrying water on the election lie, and after everyone else bailed on January 6th, Lindell was outside meeting with Trump and doing briefings with him and still advising him. Whatever it is that a crackhead has to offer as advice, I have no idea. A crackhead who makes pillows. God damn, I mean, what a downfall from grace. You're the President of the United States, and you're such a pariah that your main advisor at the end, the only person who stuck by you to the very bitter end, is a crackhead who makes pillows. Holy fuck. Okay, so anyway, the crackhead is someone who has gone on the record many times from 2016 to the present saying that God has anointed Donald Trump to be president. As I mentioned earlier, religious nut jobs need to be kept away from public office. Anyone who thinks the apocalypse sounds cool is a fucking lunatic and needs to be put away, or at least barred from holding office. Lindell, look, I know that Republicans who are watching this might get pissed off if they're still watching at this point. I'm sure at this point they rage quit a long time ago, but if some of them made it at this point, they'll be like, no, Lindell's pretty cool. He recovered from crack with the power of Jesus. Okay, listen. I know and you know that even if you think he's a great guy and you think that he's a great supporter of Trump and that he was a loyalist and he deserves our respect and he's a success, blah, 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 you know goddamn well you are not going to vote for a crackhead. No one is voting for a crackhead. The only time that happens is when you're in a meaningless local election and the dominant party has a crackhead on the ballot. That happened here in Columbus in a treasurer's race. And there was a crackhead versus a religious fanatic who was the Republican nominee. A religious fanatic who looked like he had something wedged deep up his ass. So, yeah, look, guys, that's the only way you win as a crackhead. You have to win in a race that is over before it begins, where the party primary is the only actual contest. If you're running for national office, being a crackhead is a non-starter. So I'm sure Mike Lindell's a nice guy. He seems sincere. He's not a faker, I don't think. I believe he is sincere in his support for Donald Trump, for whatever that's worth. But in the context of needing to get votes, it's not worth shit when so many other people have that same qualification and didn't get caught smoking fucking crack. Next up is Mike Pompeo. He's an Army veteran. He's a Tea Party dude. Former Secretary of State under Trump, and before that, he was Trump's CIA director. So he's another guy who can claim to be a loyalist. He served in 2 positions. He helped Trump fight off accusations of Russiagate a little bit, but for the most part, he was actually dealing with foreign policy. Some people think that Trump had a good foreign policy, and by some people, of course, I mean Republicans who think that he turned it around somehow. In reality, his foreign policy was basically the same as the people who came before him, with slightly, emphasis on slightly less aggression. Although he did get involved in some bullshit in Africa at one point when those soldiers died, if you will recall. So anyway, Pompeo is a guy who is both establishment in terms of his actual foreign policy views and actions, but also has some Trump credentials, so you might think, hey, this guy might have some juice. He might be able to appeal within the party broadly, and then might be taken seriously on a national stage. But again, remember, his achievements are in foreign policy, and no one votes based on foreign policy. For that reason, Pompeo is only a D. Also, he's not very charismatic. Actually, now I think about it, the charisma is a real problem. He's an E. Okay, next up is Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House and the 2012 vice presidential nominee. Paul Ryan, in a Republican primary, would be seen as an enemy of Trump and someone who bailed on the Orange God in the middle of his presidency because he was clearly unhappy with what was going on. Paul Ryan is a hardcore fiscal conservative and an ideological Randian. He is someone whose policies are deeply unpopular when he actually unveils them. Even among Republicans, the idea of slashing Social Security or privatizing it and then dicking over Medicare and Medicaid, that is not popular. And especially if you think about a general election, Paul Ryan was an absolute menace to the Romney campaign. It was the worst pick Romney could have made. He did it to salve his own base, but in reality, what he did was really scare independents. Obama wasn't doing that hot in 2012, but with Paul Ryan on the ballot, that was a reason to vote against Romney, even if you didn't want to vote for Obama. Because Paul Ryan was scary. My dad is not the most political guy in the world, and he's certainly not a leftist like me. But Paul Ryan scared the ever-loving shit out of him. And to this day, he hates Paul Ryan more than any other politician in America. And he's a guy who grew up in the Cold War. He's scared shitless of Bernie Sanders' socialism. But I asked him one time, would you rather have Paul Ryan or Bernie Sanders as president? And he said Bernie. And he had very little hesitation. So Paul Ryan is the kind of guy who scares the shit out of the centrist. And I actually think that there's another general rule about politics here. And that is that it's hard to win a primary or a general if you're seen as being more ideologically driven than materially driven. And what I mean by that is that it's okay to have strong ideological commitments, but they can't be your primary thing. Or they have to be balanced out by some real-world experience or by some more concrete examples of what you want. But Paul Ryan is almost purely ideological in his Randianism. There's very little real-world application of what he's doing. He's just trying to enact a fantasy. And he doesn't really give a fuck about how bad it looks or what the real world impact would be. He just wants to do it because this is what he thinks about when he jerks off. He wants to gut the state and have a minimal state with very low taxes for the wealthy And when he had his budget proposal, budget balancing, the media said, well, Paul Ryan's a serious thinker and an intellectual, and his plan for balancing the budget would take 30 fucking years, and in fact, in the next 10 years, it would blow it up way out of proportion, because he would do massive tax cuts for the wealthy combined with some pretty massive slashes, but the cuts would be bigger than the slashes. So he would be cutting revenue more than he'd be cutting spending, so he'd actually make the deficit worse, while also fucking up the economy because of lack of federal funds, and really fucking poor people. So Paul Ryan, abominable, horrible person. I fucking hate him. And the fact that he will probably live for another 30 or 40 years, frankly, pisses me off. Fuck you, Paul Ryan. Please die young. You're enough. Okay. Next up is Rand Paul, also known as Ron Paul's son, aka Eraserhead, son of the Leprechaun. So Rand Paul is one of the more fascinating people in American politics in general. Rand is someone who is libertarian-ish, but also has a bunch of social conservative views which actually don't mesh with being a libertarian. Now, I know Ron Paul also was strongly anti-abortion, but still got credit for being a libertarian. If he was a true libertarian, however, he wouldn't give a shit about those issues, and he would say that people should make the decision for themselves. Anyway, Rand Paul is fascinating in the sense that I think you can learn a lot about any given person by asking them their political opinion of Rand Paul. And what I think you'll find is that, with almost without exception, most people will have a very ambivalent response, where they will talk about the parts of him that they like, the parts of him that they don't like, and they'll probably conclude with, so I'm not really a fan, but also I kind of respect him because I believe that he's genuine. And then if you press further about his personality, they'll say, yeah, he comes off as kind of a smart-ass little weasel. I find it very interesting how Rand Paul's oddities are actually unifying. And that's something that, say, a leftist and a Trump person could possibly have a conversation about and find some common ground, oddly enough. So, there you go. That's what you should talk about at Thanksgiving the next time you're stuck with your conservative uncle. You're welcome. Anyway, so Rand Paul is anti-war, more so than most senators, although I think he gets a little too much credit. He also is against regulation, which is something that Republicans generally like, but he is not really a fan of protectionism, so he clashed with Trump some on that, and he is more anti-war than Trump, so there was some clashing there. He is someone that people respect a decent amount, but also, as I said, he does come off as a bit of a smart-ass little fuck at times, so he does piss people off a bit, but you can't really hate him, you just kind of get a little angry. The problem with Rand Paul is that he has no real die-hard enemies, or friends or supporters. So, there's no one he can really rail against in a debate who is his bitter enemy that he can really smash, because that's not really what he does. He's kind of like Bernie in the sense that no one legitimately hates him in the party, but a lot of people kind of dislike him. Also, though, they kind of respect him at the same time. So, it's hard for him to really find a foe, and he's not the kind of person to get super personal. He held the high ground against Jack Conway when he was initially elected to the Senate, when Conway accused him of being into the Aqua Buddha because of some prank or something Rand Paul did a long time ago. The problem with Rand is that, unlike his father, he does not have a hardcore, ardent following of people who are Rand Paul ride or die, but he also might have a slightly broader appeal than his dad, and he's also, frankly, less leprechaun-esque. Ron Paul, I always just picture him every time I heard him speak about the gold standard as a little leprechaun, and the fact that he kind of looks like a leprechaun didn't help at all. So every time I see Ron Paul clips, I kind of laugh a little bit, because I always picture him in a green suit pointing to a rainbow. Anyway, Rand I could see as a VP, actually. If the person who's nominated is a little bit too pro-war, I could see them putting Rand Paul in the ticket to balance it out, or if the person is a little too, say, doesn't have a very good record on civil liberties or whatever it might be, then Rand Paul as the VP might signal that they're trying to back away from their past. So for that reason, I think that he can have an impact in the primaries. In a general, he would be okay, but it would really depend on what the Democrats do. I could see him winning Joe Biden style in the sense that the people who are voting for him are actually voting against whoever the Democrats put up. So actually, now that I think about Rand, I think he's a solid C. The problem is trying to get out of the primary, and I'm giving him some credit for being a VP contender, which I know it's crazy early to think about that, but I think he actually balances tickets pretty well for a whole hell of a lot of these guys. Next up is Mitt Romney. He will be 77 years old, so although he has had several facelifts to look younger, Mitt Romney is in fact an old man, and it is finally starting to show. He probably will not run any ads where he's trying to appear vigorous while he jogs. He's a proven loser, and Republicans in general are not very kind to people who failed them. Although, of course, the Trump people are still in love with Donald, but that's because he lied about losing, and they still haven't accepted the fact that he did in fact lose. Therefore, he's a loser. Anyway, Mitt Romney, they consider him a rhino. I do not. Mitt Romney is not super socially conservative, but this man is the kind of guy who wanted to make Paul Ryan one heartbeat away from the presidency. He is hardcore right-wing on economics, way to the right of most people in the Republican base, even. If Romney's not a Republican, I don't know what the fuck a Republican is. I guess a lot of these Republicans identify on like these dipshit cultural issues that don't matter. But really, it should be more about economics. And on economics, Romney is the king of Republicans. He wants to give as many tax breaks as possible to the wealthy, have no elite accountability, and just fuck over poor people in every possible orifice. Maybe create a few new ones. Anyway, Romney, I don't think has all that much credibility. He's old, proven loser. He does have some standing with the Never Trump crowd, but I see him more as a great endorsement to get with that crowd than as someone who can go the distance. And clearly, he will not get over with the Trump crowd, because although he did try to reconcile with Trump, it never really went that far, and in the Senate, he was an open opponent of Trump. So again, I think there are people who will respect him, and a lot of Democrats respect him for that. But ultimately, he is unviable, and his views are also unviable. He's an F. And in general, he's already a proven loser. He'd definitely lose again. Even if he ran against somebody shitty, he'd still lose. If there's a shitty Democrat and then a shitty Republican in the form of Ryan or Romney, then the natural advantage Democrats have in registration plays out, and the Democrat squeaks it. Next up is Ron DeSantis, or as I like to think of him, Captain Overrated. Republicans think of this guy as a rising star and a real stud, but I'm here to tell you, this man is a dud. See what I did there? Let's see, where do I begin here? First of all, even Republicans who think he's great admit that he's a piss-poor, lazy campaigner. That's not a good sign, given that the man's only in his early 40s. If you're thinking of him as a potential superstar going forward, he's not going to get more energetic and engaging as he gets older. So, there's that. They also think that because he won a tight race against Andrew Gillum, who I believe is a meth head, by the way, that he is a superstar. Spoiler alert. He's a Republican in Florida. Although the Democrats have the manpower in terms of registered voters to win in Florida, they're systematically incapable of finding a single competent politician to run. The Democrats run the weakest, shittiest people who have ever lived for office in Florida, and they wonder why they keep losing despite having half the state. It's a mystery. So anyway, DeSantis beat someone on easy mode, barely. Very popular with Republicans, for whatever reason, I guess because he's very right-wing. He is, however, someone who has some disturbing tendencies. During the COVID outbreak, he imposed no COVID restrictions. This is not something that will play with the general election audience. This will serve him well in a primary, but a general election audience will see this and run. This is not something people will think is responsible. DeSantis also sent a SWAT team after a whistleblower from the health department who was exposing some of his practices, and this points to some very authoritarian instincts. This is not something which will play well with the civil liberties crowd within the Republican field, nor will it play well at all with Democrats and independents. Using the specter of January 6th and all the accusations of Trump being a fascist, they will then transpose all of that onto DeSantis, who is a Trump lackey, and basically campaign against DeSantis as if he's an open, outright fascist. And that one piece of evidence from that raid will be enough to convince a whole lot of people on the left and in the center that DeSantis is a dangerous madman. That being said, DeSantis does have some weight in a primary. I could see him filling the Trump lane, potentially, although I don't think he's as strong as most Republicans think he is. And in the general election, this guy is a joke. He's a D. Next up is a gentleman by the name of Ben Sasse, sometimes mocked as Ben's ass. He is a PhD in American history from Yale. Given some of his positions on climate change and other things, I really think Yale should strongly consider withdrawing his degrees. But whatever. He was elected to the Senate from Nebraska in 2014, re-elected in 2020, and to his credit, he has been very consistent as an anti-Trumper. He was an early vocal opponent of Trump, said he was a never-Trumper, and unlike a lot of his more weak colleagues, Ted Cruz, cough, cough, he stuck with that. So he has a lot of credibility with the Never Trump wing or the establishment wing because he has held his ground and been very consistent. Now, he did soften up over time, and by the summer of 2020, he was kind of just carrying water, although he was not being effusive or saying that Trump was anointed by God or any of that bullshit. Then, in August, he clashed with Trump over the procedure used for COVID relief because he didn't like executive action. Trump called him a rhino and a traitor, and after that, Ben Sasse was off the wagon, and they were openly feuding. And he has opposed Trump's lie on the election, and also opposed the Trump riot. He will be 52, so he will be approximately in the area that I think will be the political prime age. He's slightly goofy looking, but aside from that, he doesn't have any huge major downsides. I mean, he's got some, as I said, I mean, the dude's a Republican. He's got some views that I find to be kind of dumb, but comparatively speaking, I guess he's not that bad. So in a general, he might be somewhat viable. He'd have to pick a running mate from a more relevant state, however, because he's from Nebraska, and he would have to fill out his policy more. He'd probably need to be a little bit more populist in terms of his messaging, and also not too hawkish on his foreign policy. I'm not really sure what his stances are, because most of his political news stories have been about his clashes with Trump. And again, it's a sad state of affairs when a party's whole identity is based around whether or not they support the ego of an obese, elderly orange man. Anyway, Ben Sasse is a fairly strong person, actually. I'm not sure if he's a B or a C. I'm going to go with a B. And again, I think that it will be easier to fill out the anti-Trump lane than the Trump lane because the Trump lane is very, very crowded. So I am considering that as an advantage. And not coincidentally, the more moderate candidates will have a better chance of winning. The dynamics of the Republican Party are the opposite of the Democrats. The Democrats win when they are distinctive and when they create separation, meaning running somewhat to the left. Republicans are more successful when they run a bit more to the center, because a lot of their views are extremely unpopular. So Trump, again, as we mentioned earlier, said, I'm not fucking with entitlements, and also I think that we should have some trade, we should not do free trade. So he appealed to people, and he came across as moderate to a lot of voters because of those positions. Okay, next up is Rick Scott, the former governor and current senator from the not-so-great state of Florida. So Rick Scott, the Trump people hold it against him that he is moderate on immigration. So because he's not for building a border wall and shutting down all immigration, he's apparently a closet liberal or some shit. That's not the case. He's actually very conservative. He was elected with the Tea Party wave, and he is someone who is conservative across the board. As governor, when medical marijuana was passed, he did his utmost to undermine that. So what he did was to try to make it where you couldn't smoke medical marijuana. You had to get edibles or whatever else, and this was overridden by the courts. So he was trying to be a dick on that. Failed. Of course, it's worth mentioning that he kind of looks like Skeletor. So if you need someone who's going to play an open heel, actually Rick Scott's pretty cool in that regard. I could see him as a movie villain. He'd be great. Not very charismatic. He did defeat Bill Nelson in 2018 for a Senate seat in an election which mostly favored Democrats. So that's actually a pretty impressive win, and it shows both that Democrats in Florida are incredibly fucking pathetic in terms of choosing viable candidates, and also what I said earlier, that Republicans who run a little bit to the middle do fine. Democrats who run to the middle, like Bill Nelson, tend to get fucked up the ass. Also see Claire McCaskill for details. So, there you go. Yeah, Tea Party guy. And he is a huge, staunch opponent of healthcare reform. It's actually how he got his start. He founded some organization trying to dick with Obamacare in 2009 before he ran for governor in 2010. So this man is deep in the pocket of pharma and the insurance companies, and he is corrupt to the core. He also, as governor, really fucked up Florida's water management, but then the people elected him again and then sent him to the Senate. Again, Florida, you guys need to get some judgment, okay? I don't know what's wrong with you. I don't know what's in the water down there that he put, but goddamn, get your shit together, okay? Anyway, so Rick Scott, he's a terrible person. All the Republican governors in 2012 are pretty much dog shit in terms of being humans, especially Scott Walker, who we're going to get to. And Rick Snyder was the fucking worst of them all, of course. Anyway, as a candidate, Rick Scott just doesn't have the charisma to win the primary. I'm not sure exactly how closely he cleaved to Trump. I feel like he kind of played the middle a bit, which means he voted with Trump all the way, gave lip service, but was never really eating out the asshole all the way. Rick Scott's an E just because, again, the guy's got no charisma and he looks like Skeletor, and that's never what you want to be. Alright, next up is Scott Walker. One of my least favorite people. There was a meme that I used to like that compared Scott Walker with Scout Walkers from the Empire, or not Empire, but Return of the Jedi, and it said, one is a soulless vehicle of oppression and the other one fights Ewoks. Get it? Haha, yes. Anyway, Scott Walker is someone who somehow is now seen as establishment by a lot of Trump people, because he's been around for a decade, I guess. But Scott Walker was a radical in 2010. He was one of the more radical governors of that class, of mostly radical governors. He went out of his way to fight public sector unions. He literally, deliberately blew a hole in the state budget, so that way he would need to make slashes in order to close that hole. So he gave corporations a shit ton of money. And then he said, alright, now we got a big deficit problem. The only way we're going to get this money is by taking it away from these overpaid public sector workers, including teachers. So I am arbitrarily going to just slash their pay and benefits. And he had a majority in the Wisconsin House and Senate. He got away with doing all this. There was a huge kerfuffle. There was an occupation of the Wisconsin House, State House, I mean. The 7 state senators who were Democrats went out of state to avoid having the vote. They eventually were brought back. The vote was held. Republicans did their thing. The teachers in Wisconsin got absolutely gutted. And then they tried to do a referendum. Scott Walker survived because the voters said that while they disapproved of what he did and how he did it, at the same time, they didn't think a referendum was appropriate. He somehow won re-election. In 2018, however, he ran for re-election for a 3rd term and lost. Scott Walker is also someone who lacks a lot of integrity. He changed the motto of the University of Wisconsin from whatever it was in Latin about learning to something in English like, let's get jobs, or I don't know what the fuck it was, or something like that, or let's create jobs, I don't know. Anyway, he then, after doing that, which was supposed to be a populist kind of thing, where he's like, I'm not one of those snobs, he then went on to say, I didn't have anything to do with that, it wasn't me, but then documents were discovered later where this was his idea. Oops. Okay, so then that all happened. Oh yeah, also one thing he does have going for him, I guess, in the primary, is that the man is very strongly anti-abortion. When he was at Marquette, he was already the leader of an anti-abortion group. So he's not a Johnny-come-lately to social conservatism that will play well in a primary. He's not terribly charismatic, but he's about on par with most of these people up here. Let's see, he's a hawk. That will get him money, but that is not where most Americans are at this point, including most Republicans. Most people are thoroughly sick of war. Scott Walker, I'm not sure exactly what his path would be. He is a two-term governor. That's always positive. He could raise money like crazy from the establishment because he's super anti-labor and also pro-intervention. He has some populist bona fides in terms of his accomplishments, at least right-wing populist bona fides, but he has no credibility on any economic issues. He's trying to be economically populist. So he's just basically fuck teachers and people with educations, but we're not going to do anything for workers. Hard to say how well that would play because Trump tries to pretend that he cares about workers, and that's sort of the new brand. I think Walker is a D. I don't think that he's the kind of guy who can really unite the party. I don't think that he's a complete dead-ender in terms of having no chance whatsoever. But there are some things in his record that would be kind of difficult to deal with. And his brand of Tea Party Republicanism really is not in vogue right now. That could come back as the Republicans are fighting their civil war. And I think that people should not underestimate the anti-Trump candidates going forward. But I don't really see Scott Walker being the guy to capture the lightning. Next up is Ted Cruz, the last girl in 2016, the last person to step down after being defeated by Trump in ignominious fashion. At the time, Cruz wanted the party to rally behind him, but it wouldn't because he had fucked them over by forcing a shutdown that McConnell didn't want, and they really didn't like him much more than they liked Trump. They also figured that Hillary would be hard to beat for whatever reason, and they figured that it would be best to let Trump lose. That way they could show their voters, see, populism is dumb. Don't do that. Let's go back to nice, pre-approved establishment figures, and also not Ted Cruz. So anyway, Ted Cruz, at this point, I believe he has positioned himself to be palatable, if not quite appealing to most Republicans. He's kind of like the Bud Light of Republicans. He's drinkable. He's not someone who will send them running for the hills. At the same time, they will not be all that enthused about him. He comes across as openly smarmy and calculating, and that is not great, but at the same time, Trump was extraordinarily abrasive. Joe Biden fought a dude with a pull chain, and they both got elected president, so, you know, maybe it doesn't matter that much. Let's see. What else about Ted Cruz? Oh, and in general, he would be basically unelectable, barring the Democratic candidate literally on tape raping a child. Ted Cruz is profoundly hated by Democrats. They find him to be Satan incarnate, especially with the beard. All you gotta do is add a little tail and some horns. He's not very appealing to independents. He's a Republican's Republican and nothing more. He would never be perceived as a moderate on any of his stances by median voters. And he's also just kind of unlikable. Let's see, what else? Oh, another thing that I always have to bring up when I talk about Ted Cruz, I'm still convinced that he would have won the Republican nomination in 2016 if he had done one thing differently. When Donald Trump insulted his wife Heidi's appearance, he should have walked over to him and punched him in the face during that debate. Had he punched Trump in the face, he would have won the nomination, and as we now know, Hillary ran an abysmal campaign, so Ted Cruz would have also had a puncher's chance of winning the presidency. And had he punched Trump in the face, Trump is a trust fund baby, he does not know how to fight, he would have acted like a bitch, it would have invalidated all of his posturing and chest thumping, and his supporters would have lost faith. And then Cruz would have won. He would have also been sued, but he would have won. And once he won the nomination, there would be a bunch of pressure on Trump to stop being a bitch. He'd have to drop the lawsuit. And Ted Cruz would then have a chance against a very weak Hillary Clinton. So anyway, that is my Ted Cruz story, and I'm sticking with it. As a candidate, I think that he is fairly formidable in a primary. He will definitely make an impact if he runs. That being said, his path is not super clear because he doesn't really fit in any box. That being said, no one absolutely will say no to him at this point. He did piss some people off with his stance trying to protect Trump and also trying to push the election lie. So rather than punching Trump in the face as he should have done, he instead licked his boots. And I don't know, a lot of the Trump people are looking for a bootlicker. And we know that secretly he doesn't really like Trump, so he could appeal to that faction. I'm going to put him in the C category. Cruz is a bit complicated. Next up, Tim Scott, the junior senator from South Carolina. Tim Scott is known for being pro-war, and in the eyes of conservatives, he is socially liberal. That's not really true. The fact is that, again, he's a black guy, and like all conservatives, he is a little bit moderate or liberal on the one issue that affects him, and guess what? That would be race issues. So, yeah, there you go. He does not think that BLM is composed of terrorists. Therefore, I guess he's a liberal. Anyway, he's very pro-war, votes for all of them, just like his colleague Lindsey Graham. He is for low taxes. He's basically just a business stooge who toes the line and is also very strong on interventionism. He is outspoken on the issues of let's go fight Iran and let's stay in Afghanistan till the end of time. Very conservative as an anti-labor guy. He's been that way before he ran for office. He hates organized labor, and in general he has deep contempt for the American worker. That's something that will appeal to the elites in the party, but will make it very hard for him to pretend to be a populist. His record does not support it. He is a little bit too aligned with Trump to really run as the anti-Trump guy, but at the same time, he has a chance as the anti-Trump guy. In a general election, I don't think his record would be very palatable. All of his anti-labor actions would be easy to lambast. Even the Democrats who suck on labor, say the Joe Bidens of the world, would be able to point out that they haven't been outright hostile. And by contrast, that makes them basically leaders of the AFL-CIO when compared to Tim Scott. So Tim Scott, completely unelectable in a general, no matter who you put with him. And in a primary, I think that he is kind of in the D tier. I could see him pulling it off just because he's somewhat new and fresh. But all the liabilities would really fuck him over. Actually, well, he's an E. What am I talking about? All the liabilities that he has in a general election would be too much. There's no way he would get elected. He would just basically hand the presidency to whoever was the Democrat. Next up is Tom Cotton. Now, according to a lot of the ardent Trump people, he was, quote, weak on the election because he didn't stick it out to the bitter end. And he is, not a true Trumpy. Well, yeah, the guy is well known as a congressman. He's got his own ambitions. No shit. Of course he wants to be president. He doesn't actually give that much of a fuck about Trump. In fact, other than Mike Lindell, none of the people on your screen care about Trump. They only care about Trump insofar as they can ride the coattails. For Steve Bannon, Trump was the closest he could get to a fucking white ethno state. He doesn't actually care about Trump. He doesn't pray for Trump at night, okay? I don't get what it is with people thinking that all these people are personally loyal to Trump. It's delusional and crazy. Anyway, Tom Cotton is someone who is very much anti-labor. One other one. So he tried to pass a bill that anyone who... Oh, no, that's Tim Scott. Sorry. Tim Scott's super anti-labor. He actually tried to pass a bill where if you become eligible for food stamps because your income dipped due to being on strike or being engaged in union activities, you don't get food stamps. You'd be deprived of government benefits for being a union person, exercising your motherfucking rights. Yeah, Tim Scott, go fuck yourself. You're a worse Scott than Rick Scott, and he fucking sucks too. You're actually sullying him by being next to him and sharing his last name. Okay, so anyway, Tom Cotton. He's a guy that a lot of conservatives like. He's from Arkansas, but some of the Trump people are now a bit upset because he didn't go to the mat on the election issue, at least not as much as some of the other people. He's pretty much a business Republican who's also a hawk, so more or less a typical post-Bush, but still Bush Republican, compatible with the Tea Party, wants to gut the state when it helps the poor, and also fight everybody abroad. I think he served in the military. Oh yeah, he had a controversy. He went to Ranger School, but didn't actually serve in the 75th Ranger Unit. So that created a stupid controversy that I don't give a shit about. Suffice it to say, if he did get nominated and then got elected, corporate America would be shitting in high cotton. No pun intended. Actually, it was intended, and I just nailed it. But that's the same for any of these Republicans and about 80% of the Democrats. Most of these people are just corporate shills. They're completely worthless, and they don't give a fuck about you. Tom Cotton is one of them. Apparently he's a good speaker, according to a lot of conservatives. I don't think so, but then again, I'm not really into all that patriotic Jesus bullshit, so I guess I'm not the right audience for that. Oh yeah, during the BLM protest over the summer of 2020, Tom Cotton wrote an editorial calling for Trump to send the troops in and clear the streets that way. Now, this is a psychotic and authoritarian position, which would make him completely unviable in a general election. However, that kind of bullshit is the kind of red meat that Republicans like, and for that reason and for his popularity among a broad swath of the Republicans, I'm actually going to make him a C. I think he has a legit shot of winning the primary. That being said, this man in the general election, he'd be easy pickings. The cotton would come right off the vine, or whatever the fuck you pick cotton off of. Donald Trump. Well, if he runs in 2024, he is the favorite to win the nomination, and then he would almost certainly lose the general. Only one president ever has come back to serve a second non-consecutive term. And only one other person has come reasonably close to doing it, that being Teddy Roosevelt. The other guy, I believe, was, Grover Cleveland, or was that Chester Arthur? I don't remember. It's one of those Gilded Age presidents nobody gives a shit about. Anyway, Donald Trump, who is also a president from the new Gilded Age. What can you say about this guy that hasn't already been said a million times? At this point, he is the cause of the Civil War. The ego, the fragile ego of this 74-year-old obese orange man will probably cost the Republicans the presidency in 2024. At a time when the Democrats are already planning to nominate Kamala Harris, one of the weakest candidates with no political instincts you can imagine. And if they lose, the Republicans I mean, it will almost certainly be because of Trump one way or another. Trump, after January 6th, lost all credibility as a national candidate. He has no chance of winning back independents or Democrats. Even if Biden cannot address economic suffering over the next 4 years, it would be very hard for Trump to make the case that he could do better since he allowed COVID to get to where it is through his own incompetence. So he is not someone who's terribly viable in a general. He's also a proven loser, and the anti-Trump wing will run on that. Even when he won in 2016, he still lost the popular vote by 2.8 million. And that was his, quote, landslide victory. In 2020, he lost by about 7 million votes. And this is running against probably the weakest candidates the Democrats had, a guy who barely knows where he's at, a guy who didn't really have a platform, who barely campaigned, who just ran a referendum, and referendums are almost always a failure at the presidential level. And even at the gubernatorial level, as I mentioned with Scott Walker and his state senators, all of whom were unpopular, still won because people don't like the idea of referendums. And also, just running a strictly negative campaign rarely works, especially for Democrats. So, Donald Trump has no excuse for losing in 2020 except for his own stupidity. And his messaging was piss poor. Whatever populist messaging he had in 2016, talking about fighting the establishment and talking about undoing bad trade deals and all that, he was just talking about the left is crazy and they suck, vote for me. That was his message. So I think that it's safe to say he has no chance in a general election going forward. In a primary, he would be the runaway favorite if he runs. If he does not run, then it's a much more interesting field. If he does run, then he probably wins, and if he doesn't win, it's a massive humiliation, and it is akin to when Gerald Ford, the former president, tried to run in 1980 and got beaten by Reagan. And while I do think that he would be the favorite in the primary, I don't think he's a lock. The anti-Trump faction is still strong, and Trump, as time passes and he doesn't have Twitter, will probably lose a lot of his stature. Also, he's getting older. He will be 78 by the time of the election. And again, he's an old, obese man. His health is not going to hold steady. He will not be as sharp in 4 years as he is now. And granted, the man has never been a Rhodes Scholar, but keep in mind that he's not going to get more energetic or more witty over time. If anything, he will lose in both areas. So he will be a less vigorous campaigner. He will decline even more as a speaker, and he's already basically incoherent at times. So for that reason, because I don't think he has any legit chance of winning the general, and because he would hold back a few people who might have at least a chance, I'm going to put him in the D tier. Next up is Don Jr. He's like his dad, but worse. And that's not really entirely fair, actually, but the thing about Don Jr. is when I see him speak, when he's not trying to be political and he's not trying to do the imitation of his dad, he's not bad, which is weird. When he's just being himself, he's not that bad. When he tries to do an imitation of his dad, it's just a shittier version. And I don't know why he keeps doing it. Because it looks and sounds like ass when he tries to do the hand gestures. He can't do it. Maybe he just doesn't believe the same things his dad does and he's trying to do something he doesn't believe. I don't know. But the man's not convincing. One thing I respect about Don Jr. is that unlike his father, he actually does date age-appropriate women. His girlfriend's actually almost a decade older than he is. So I think that's interesting. Don Jr. is not completely superficial. There might be something there on some level. I mean, he can see beyond the surface, at least in one area. Something that I cannot say for his father. I think he's probably a better man than his father. That being said, he's still kind of a douche. He went to Africa to hunt endangered species and posed as a tough guy and tried to challenge Hunter Biden to some sort of bullshit fight or some... I don't remember. But to be fair, Hunter Biden, a former veteran, and also a guy who used to buy crack in some of those dangerous neighborhoods of LA. If there was a street fight, Don Jr. and Eric versus Hunter Biden, my money's completely on Hunter. Hunter would wipe the floor with these little fucks. Anyway, Don Jr. in the future could cash in on his name if he manages to get his own political identity. But until and unless he does that, he's an F. Because his Trump imitation is abysmal. Okay. Next up is Tucker Carlson. He's a guy who has a little bit of credibility with a few people on the left, especially the economic left, of which I'm a part. And the reason is that he is occasionally right on stuff. He occasionally says something reasonable about trade or wages or class and inequality. That being said, Tucker is a country club Republican, and he latched on the right-wing populism after it turned out that being an elitist snob douche does not get you a big following. That was Tucker's secret. And he latched on to these issues a little bit before Trump, so he has a tiny bit of credibility. But Tucker's true self you can see from 2004 on Crossfire, when he was just a bow tie wearing dweeb who got destroyed by Jon Stewart. Anyway, Tucker has some name recognition. He was on Fox, and up until recently, pretty much all Republicans relied on Fox. So the problem is, over the next 4 years, Republicans are now divided between Fox, OAN, and Newsmax. That will not change, especially with the internet being what it is. People having easy access to things that aren't Fox. So this means that Tucker will no longer have a monopoly on Republican audiences, and they will increasingly tune into other hosts. So they will forget about Tucker. So he'll become more marginalized. If Fox were still dominant the way that it was before this election cycle and before the Republican Civil War after Trump, well, maybe Tucker in that case might have an outsider chance of being this sort of media figure who rises up. But as it is, his standing is going to decline over the next 4 years. That's going to be a problem. And in the general election, the problem with Tucker is that while he sometimes sounds a few of the right notes, he has no policy intention in terms of actually doing anything. And when it comes to his social views, he's fairly conservative. Those views are outdated and no longer popular. And also, he has been accused on many occasions of being racist. And were he nominated, all of those accusations would come to the surface, and he'd get absolutely hammered on that. Tucker is an E. I think Tucker, as a viable candidate, either in the Republican primary or in the general, is vastly overrated. And I find it funny that there are people who think that he's up there, he's an A or a B. Again, the Republican media infrastructure, the Republican landscape, now divided into at least 3. And there's no way that he'll maintain a standing. I just can't see him beating out actual politicians who have experience on the stump. Also, Tucker, when he's contradicted, tends to become a whiny little bitch because, again, he's a trust fund baby, doesn't know how to fight, doesn't know how to stand up for himself, all he knows how to whine. So that would not go well if he were in a debate. Last, not least, is Will Hurd, who is a never-Trumper. He is a black gentleman. I forget what state. He was a CIA agent. I believe they said that he was in clandestine operations. So maybe he is the black Michael Weston. And he will be 47 in 2024, so prime age. He's an expert in cybersecurity, which is something that if there is a big cyber attack over the next few years, maybe that will come to the fore. I could see him potentially, if he's with somebody who has no foreign policy experience, maybe being a VP to shore it up. He seems like the kind of guy who still has agency contacts, who might give some establishment credibility. So maybe if there's an outsider candidate, maybe Tucker does a lot better than I think he can. Maybe Will Hurd helps balance the ticket because as a black guy, he doesn't make Tucker look racist. And then also, as a guy who was in the CIA, he has a lot of actual government experience. So if there is one of these outsidery candidates who makes it, maybe Will Hurd is a VP. Outside of that, I don't really know how far he could go. I don't know that much about him aside from his background. All that being said, I see nothing in his record that makes me think that he's unviable, but I also see nothing in his record that makes me think Republicans will latch on. And with the current conspiracy-heavy atmosphere of the Republican Party, I have to think that his CIA connections would be a detriment. I'm going to put him in the D tier, but this is another one where I'm not all that confident, and I don't really know how Republican voters would respond to him. So anyway, here is my list on the 2024 Republicans. Comment below to let me know whether you agree or whether you want to exercise your right to be wrong. Until next time, I'm Spirit of Thersites. I should not have spent this much time on this bullshit, but I did. So there you go. Remember to subscribe to this channel. Click the notification bell. All of that other bullshit. I'm also available on Patreon, Discord. It's all in the description. Peace the fuck out.